Okay, good afternoon, everyone. You're all very welcome to this the first EU Moses webinar. My name's Stephen Hines. I'm head of the Socioeconomic Marine Research Unit here in NUI Galway, based in the Whitaker Institute. So just to give you a bit of a background first on the Moses project, it's a 3-year project funded under the EU Interreg Atlantic Area Programme. It involves 8 partners across 5 countries, the 5 Atlantic Arc member states of Ireland, Spain, Portugal, France, and the UK. The main objective of the Moses project was to look at the size and the growth of key marine industries across the Atlantic Arc area and to identify and assess the sectoral pressures on the marine environment in that region. And also to look at the vulnerability of the coastal zone in across the Atlantic Arc member states as well as a result of those sectoral pressures. And relevant, I suppose, to today's webinar, we also, each partner on the project took a case study, a particular industry to look at, to demonstrate what might be sustainable transition pathways for those industries. And so with that in mind, NUI Galway decided to focus in on marine and coastal trail development, and in particular to look at the very successful Wild Atlantic Way, which runs 2,500 kilometres along the Irish west coast. Daithí, our first speaker from Fáilte Ireland, is going to give a bit more detail on that a bit more background on that in a few minutes. So I suppose, what is a sustainable tourism trail? Well, one definition I like is it's a trail that seeks to provide people with an exciting, immersive and educational holiday experience, but that is also of benefit to the local community and does not damage the local environment or society. So I think that's a nice way of thinking about it. And in this seminar, these issues are going to be discussed from both a demand side perspective and a supply side perspective. The supply side being the perspective of the stakeholders at one particular point along the Wild Atlantic Way, and on the demand side, Danny's going to talk about the views of tourists that were interviewed along the Wild Atlantic Way and have a look at expenditure patterns as well, and where they're going and what they're doing. So we have 3 excellent speakers. Our first speaker is Daithí Gallagher. He's Wild Atlantic Way team manager from Fáilte Ireland. And Fáilte Ireland, for those of you who don't know it, is the National Tourism Development Authority in Ireland. And they were responsible for the development of the Wild Atlantic Way. So Daithí will introduce the Wild Atlantic Way and speak a bit about what Fáilte Ireland are doing to make sure that it is sustainable in the future, going into the future. Daniel Norton is a researcher on the Moses project based at NUI Galway, and like I said, Danny's going to provide the demand side perspective, presenting the results of the Wild Atlantic Way Tourism Survey. And then we have Desiree Farrell, who is doing her PhD in the discipline of geography at NUI Galway, and Desiree is going to present the supply side perspective, looking at building a sustainable marine tourism trail through community voices, looking in particular at Rathmullen in County Donegal. So just before we proceed with our 3 speakers, just note that if you have any questions, you can post them on the question and answers tab. So the chat function is disabled, but please do put up your questions on the question and answer tab, using the question and answer tab, and we'll get through them after the presentation. So if you have any questions for the speakers, note them down there and we'll come back to them at the end and get the speakers' responses. So with that, I'm going to hand over to our first speaker, Daithí Gallagher. Thanks, Daithí.
That's great, Stephen. Thanks very much. I'm just going to take control of the screen there now. You might tell me if I'm up and running okay, Stephen. That would be great. Can you see that?
Yeah, perfect.
Great. Okay, so as Stephen said, my name is Daithí Gallagher. I'm the team manager for the Wild Atlantic Way, with a specific remit looking after Clare, Limerick and Galway. Is that flashing there? It is.
It is.
Working okay there now?
Yeah, perfect now, yeah.
Great. Technical issues, you gotta love it for these webinars. So yeah, my objective, I suppose, is just to speak for the next 10 minutes or so and give you a quick snapshot of the Wild Atlantic Way what it is, and what I suppose Fáilte Ireland's plans are for it in terms of development in the years ahead. And I'll just bring you through, first and foremost, just a quick overview of the route itself. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, but I'm conscious that there may be some overseas visitors on the webinar here at the moment. And just to explain, it's a driving route that stretches 2,500 kilometers of our Atlantic coastline. What it boasts really is just spectacular scenery, some of the most exceptional scenery you'll see in the world, and unrivaled experiences. And I suppose that Ireland is known for its experiential offering, and particularly on the west coast, where culture, language, and the arts in particular are alive. And really, it boasts it's strategically located, and it's in a perfect location for enhancing that visitor experience. Moving on from that, I suppose to focus on what our objectives in Fáilte Ireland are for the Wild Atlantic Way. We focus primarily on product development, enhancing the destination experience, and establishing sustainable tourism models. So really, just to delve down into a little more depth on those. In terms of product development, when we talk about product, we talk about the experiences that consumers and the tourists avail of while they visit the area. And we look at how we can increase and enhance that. So to give you an example, I know in Clare, for example, the Gallagher Caves, we might have some people on the call who would have, as children, had visited the Gallagher Caves. And years ago, that was the offer. It was the Gallagher Caves, and it was famous because it was on Father Ted as well, and we all went to visit it. In recent years, the experience itself was developed to have a more sustainable approach, so that the entirety of its offering wasn't focused on one aspect or one area. So at the moment, the Gallagher Caves not only offer the cave experience, but they also do a hawk walk. They have a nature trail. They have an on-site shop which produces its own honey and its own cheeses, and they then provide that to the local area. And there's also plans to expand and develop an adventure offering where you can go caving, which was something I wasn't too familiar with, but you can actually go in through the cave itself and gear up in the relevant equipment. So that's a huge part of the work that we do, is to look at the tourist offering and see how we can enhance it, look at the existing offering and see how we can enhance and improve it. That then is inextricably linked with the destination experience, but that focuses a lot then on the outdoor-indoor divide. Needless to say, the biggest challenge for us is the weather. And we have to ensure that a lot of our destinations, particularly in Galway, has that indoor experience. And that's something that we'll be enhancing in the years ahead with a state-of-the-art museum in Galway, the Wild Atlantic Museum, in the years ahead. Then and I'm delighted that Stephen mentioned the sustainable tourism, the description there as being one where that reflects on the environment and the society. And that's what we talk about in Fáilte Ireland in terms of establishing sustainable tourism models, ones that not only are reflective of the environmental impact, but also look at local economies and how people are benefiting from tourists visiting each area. And on that note, we look at some of the tourism hotspots in Ireland at the moment, and this is a really famous map in the tourism industry. It looks at the consumer trends and the tourist trends and how people visit Ireland, and it's very evident. If you draw a line between Galway and Dublin and just look south of that, that's where the tourists exist at the moment. And this creates a number of issues, primarily overpopulation, over tourism, and high density tourism, where it becomes unsustainable, where it has a profoundly negative impact on the environment. And we also saw the creation of some bigger issues. For example, Dublin, the Dublin-Clare link here. Clare should be far more red on that map, but the reality is that at the moment, one of the biggest visitor destinations in the country is the Cliffs of Moher. But the type of tourism behaviour that developed around that was that coaches would leave Dublin, visit the Cliffs of Moher, they jump out, get their photo, jump back in and head back to Dublin. And this is why I wanted to emphasise the societal impact of over-tourism, where it's vital that the sustainability element includes the sustainability for the local economy, and that in that instance, the people of Clare see that not only have they a signature destination on their doorstep, but they feel the impact of it. So what we do and what we work to achieve is to develop plans and implement projects to ensure that the visitors stay, that they stay for longer periods, and that we don't have this over-tourism element, but that we can disperse our visitor, and that map becomes far more, rather than being red and blue, which we're all used to seeing red and blue on the election front in the last few weeks. It's a different type of red and blue here, but it's vital that we see that gradually turn orange across the coast and across the country. I mentioned just development plans, and that's where we focus our energy. And I'm just going to draw your attention to two in particular here, because the Burren Cliffs of Moher Visitor Experience Plan, that focuses directly on the Cliffs of Moher, the impact that's being had by over-tourism there. And there's the gradual development of a master plan, which will see an enhancement of the amenities that are at the Cliffs of Moher, but also looking at the sustainable tourism development. We'll be exploring a concept such as visitor caps on numbers, which is a trend that we're seeing across the globe, where destinations are actually reflecting on the amount and the capacity that they can afford to keep and afford to visit each area. Then I also have the Connemara Coast and Aran Islands. Connemara is synonymous with tourism. It's a tourism hub, and we particularly saw that in the last 6 months. And really, that's just how we develop that product that's already on offer and ensure that we disperse the visitor, as I previously mentioned. And I suppose just to sum up some of those development plan objectives that we have, really it focuses on dispersing the visitor, increasing the length of a visitor stay, because as I said, it's all too frequently that we get day trip experiences, and what we want to do is enhance the product offer to ensure that people stay longer and spend money in the economy. Responsible tourism and the environmental impact, needless to say, that would be the primary context of a lot of the content of this webinar. But in terms of responsible tourism, we have great projects and action plans. For example, in the Burren plan, we have Be a Custodian for a Day, a plan that we'll be developing with the Burren Geopark, that looks at an actual experience for people to how they can visit an area and actually be environmentally conscientious as they're there, how they can care for the area, and an entire visitor experience based around that. And again, extending the peak seasons, making sure that each tourism offering has a meaningful impact on the economy, and driving tourists north of Galway. I shouldn't be saying that in this. I know this is a very Galway focused webinar, but it is essential that we don't have these tourism red spots and hot spots, that we can disperse the visitor and make it far more sustainable. I did want to throw this in also. I'll be finishing up shortly and keeping things relatively brief for you. But I did want to just mention the COVID context, because really it's seeing a change in consumer behaviour. And there's a very well-known professor in environmental sustainability called Terry Stevens, who makes the argument that what we're seeing with COVID is not new trends, but an acceleration of existing trends. And that in particular, I've just focused on three, is an increase in domestic tourism. Needless to say, our international tourist disappeared this year for obvious reasons. But as it happens, there was an increase in staycations, and there was an existing increase in domestic travel. And what happened all of a sudden was that that exploded over the summer. We also have this tourist reassurance. They want to know now, in the context of what has happened, that where they're going is safe and it's clean and it's hygienic. And tourists are also spending a lot more time planning their trip. They're investigating things much more. They're spending more time prior to booking to explore an area and see what they want to see and find those authentic experiences while they're there that are far more rich in their and cultural, rather than the trademark kind of hotspots, as I said earlier. And then finally, just looking at statistics around this, and it's interesting to look at it from that COVID conscious tourist. Am I confident that that by taking precautions, that I'll stay safe by taking precautions and looking after my hygiene? We're seeing a little bit of COVID fatigue in some senses, where that drops to 36%. Am I worried about falling sick no matter what happens if how much I take care of myself? That's on the rise. That's up at 38%. In terms of people adhering to social distancing, people who don't pay attention, 15%. So if we look at that statistic, we are all more conscious of our social distancing and our awareness. Am I careful to adhere to social distancing measures? 73%. So we're seeing a change in consumer behavior and consumer trends. And that's going to have a huge impact on our sustainability model and how the consumer treats and behaves. It treats their trip, and also how they behave while they're visiting an area. So look, that's a quick snapshot of some of the work we're doing. As I said, we'll have the opportunity for questions at the end. And I didn't want to go over too much on time, but really it's a huge, it's an exceptional offering, the Wild Atlantic Way, and what it does for tourist areas across the coast. It's internationally recognized. You may have seen that Lonely Planet mentioned it in the top 20 destinations in the world recently. And it has become one of Ireland's most well-known and exceptional tourist experiences. So look, I look forward to your questions later on, and I'll hand you back to Stephen here, who'll send you over to the other speakers, and Gurmil Maggie.
Thanks very much for that, Daithí. Really interesting, and actually it was interesting what you were saying there at the end. Something we've seen in our own research here was that marine active tourists, they tend to stay longer and also spend more. So you know, as I suppose a strategy targeting those kind of individuals if your goal is to maximize revenue, is probably a good strategy to follow. And also, of course, the activities you're talking about there lend themselves, marine related recreational activities lend themselves quite well to social distancing. So yeah, so really interesting thoughts there. Thanks. So I'm going to pass it on to Daniel now, who's going to give us an overview of some of the results he found in his survey of the tourists along the Wild Atlantic Way. Thanks, Daniel. I think you're muted.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Perfect. Yeah.
Yeah, perfect. Sorry. So this is a survey we done in 2019, the summer of 2019, for the Moses project. It was work undertaken with Stephen Hines, Liam Carr, Francis Fatty, and Desiree Farrell in the Department of Geography, as well, and Rebecca Corliss in SEMRU. So just looking at other work we've done. Sorry, it's a bit slow. Just give you an overview of the presentation. I'll talk briefly about tourism in coastal and marine areas based on previous work that SEMRU has done, and I'll then go through the Wild Atlantic Way survey that was undertaken in summer 2019 for the Moses project, and then give the results, which looks at the characteristics of the tourists, expenditure patterns, and then looking at this, how do we measure pressures and sustainability. So just looking at marine tourism, we had 2 surveys done in SEMRU previous to this survey. One in 2018 was looking at overseas tourists. So as you can see, this mirrors the tourist map that Daithí showed, where the overseas tourists are congregated in the areas south of Galway to Dublin line as such, in the south of Ireland. But this differs then if we look at domestic tourists. You get a more even spread out, and this is what he's talking about when he's talking about making that red and blue map into a more of an orange colour. So you can see for domestic tourists, and this is in relation to marine tourism, you get a wider spread of tourism around the coast when you compare it to the overseas tourists. So building on this work then, we decided to undertake a survey of holidaymakers in the Wild Atlantic Way. We surveyed 603 tourists, so of that it was slightly more biased towards the overseas, where we had 325 compared to 278 Irish, and we undertook it at 6 locations across the Wild Atlantic Way. So these were Buncrana in the north, Sligo, Galway City, Doolin near the Cliffs of Moher, and then Dingle, and finally Clonakilty. The survey took an average of 10 minutes, and it was carried out over 2 weeks near the peak summer season, so just before the August bank holiday weekend in 2019. So they were asked about what activities they were undertaking, they were asked about their expenditure, and we also asked them about some questions about tourist-related pressures on the route. So just looking at some of the initial results, so 46% Irish compared to 54% overseas. In both categories, we had slightly more males than females, and the average age was around 46. In terms of had they heard about the Wild Atlantic Way before, so for the Irish it was 99%, so nearly all the Irish people had heard about the Wild Atlantic Way, while a lot of the tourists had as well, the overseas tourists, in that nearly 4 out of 5 people had heard about the Wild Atlantic Way before coming on it. In terms of the composition of the parties, we've seen a difference between Irish and overseas. So Irish are more likely to travel alone or with family, whereas the overseas are actually more likely to travel either a boat relative to the Irish, where they travel with friends and family. And when we look at the mean party size, that's reflected that we get a smaller party size for the Irish because you have more people travelling alone. But on the other hand, for the Irish, we have a lot more children. We're more likely to see children in the travel party compared to overseas tourists. When we look at expenditure and time spent, so we split it up between the Republic of Ireland and the Wild Atlantic Way. So in terms of the Irish, for their whole holiday in the Republic of Ireland, they spend just under €1,000, and most of that is spent in the Wild Atlantic Way. This compares to the overseas tourists that are spending nearly double that amount, over €1,900, and it's closer amount in the Wild Atlantic Way amount. And the reason for this is when we look at the mean spend per day, either on the Wild Atlantic Way or in the Republic of Ireland as a total, you can see that they're very similar. So what's driving this is the difference in the number of days that are spent on holidays. So for the Irish, they're spending 4 out of 5 days on the Wild Atlantic Way of their holiday. Now these are tourists that are surveyed on the Wild Atlantic Way, so that makes sense. But for the overseas tourists, we can see that they're spending just over 5 days on the Wild Atlantic Way out of a total trip of nearly 8.5 days. So the difference is the number of days that they're spending on the Wild Atlantic Way, and then they're spending the other, say, 3 days in the rest of the Republic. When we look at how that expenditure breaks down, and this is total party expenditure, we can see that the largest one is accommodation. So accommodation is taken over 40% of the budget is spent on accommodation, and this is the same for both overseas and Irish. And the similar amounts are spent. The Irish spend a little bit more of their budget on eating out and socialising, and a little bit more on petrol and diesel. But you can see then when we go down to car rental, we don't see as much Irish, nearly non-existent. So that's dominated by the overseas tourists, so it makes sense. But from this, we can see that the bulk of the spending is in accommodation and eating out and socialising. And we can see this. Daithí was talking about the COVID, so these are obviously two sectors that are massively affected by the COVID and the lack of overseas tourists this year. When we look at the activities, so for both groups, or not both groups, but overall the largest kind of activity was visiting pubs. So we see the Irish slightly partake in this at a higher percentage than the overseas tourists. But then when we look at walking, the next most common thing to do along the Wild Atlantic Way was walking along the coast or a beach. So you can see the natural environment really, really important here, and the landscape, and having a clean landscape for the tourists is really the underlying asset that the people are coming for the Wild Atlantic Way. We can also see this in terms of other land-based trips to the beach or seaside, swimming in the sea, hill walking, hiking. These are all coming up as the activities that are mostly undertaken. When we look at the highest one for overseas, we can see that touring and sightseeing was classed as the highest activity that was undertaken. And then there's also a big difference in visiting heritage attractions. So these are things like castles or country houses. So these were nearly double amount was done by overseas compared to Irish people. Then some lesser events that weren't as popular but are still in a significant percentage of activity. So we can see that visiting festivals, taking trips to the islands, whale and dolphin watching, undertaking visits to museums, art galleries, interpretive centres, and then when we get into more activities in the water, so swimming was the first one, but now we're starting to see surfing, and again, other marine activities in the water are at a lower rate. What we found before in the marine surveys we've done, that although there's a lower percentage of people undertaking these activities, they tend to spend longer and spend more in the Wild Atlantic Way or in the region that they're staying in. So these, while they're small as a percentage of the total number of activities, they're quite valuable from a tourist point of view if you can find your niche in this market. And finally, some of the other stuff that wasn't as large, but still were things like the more specialized things: fishing, angling in rivers, visiting lighthouses, fishing, angling from the shore of a boat, horse riding, scuba diving, so quite specialized sports. So after looking at expenditure and activities, the next thing to look at was to assess the tourist perceptions of the pressures of the Wild Atlantic Way. So there was three things we were looking at. So visitor numbers, traffic, and the quality of the transport infrastructure. So to assess this, we were asked for three highlights. This was an open-ended question. If the first highlight was a location, then we followed up with questions on the number of tourists in the area, if there was overcrowding, the level of traffic, and the quality of the transport infrastructure. So of the 600 or so tourists we asked, we got over 1,500 highlights, and of those 635 could be linked to a location, and of those 635 then about a third of them were asked a follow-up question related to traffic and number of visitors and the traffic infrastructure. When we break this down by county, we can see that the size of the circles correlates with the number of responses, and obviously as most of the activity was done and the survey is satisfied, we see the larger numbers in the southern region. But when we ask about the number of tourist numbers, we can see that the evidence backs up what we're saying in terms of you're more likely to get locations where the tourist was alone in the likes of Mayo or Donegal, or where there was few other tourists in the northern region, compared to when we look at the southern region, where location was given as a highlight. You can see that you're seeing more reds, particularly in Galway, Clare, and Kerry, so where you're seeing where it was very busy with tourists or overcrowded with tourists. So this goes back to Daithí's point, we trying to spread these tourists out along the Wild Atlantic Way, and especially, as he said, north of Galway. When we look at the level of road traffic, we see a similar story, and where we see that in Mayo and in Sligo, you have little to low road traffic or low volumes of traffic compared to some of the other areas. Now, there is some places, some locations, say in Cork, were given where you do see low volumes of traffic. So you can, and again in Kerry. So there is, it's not like these counties are overridden by tourists. There is spots, but just generally we're finding that the tourist centre rate, that there's higher levels of road traffic along these locations. When we looked then at transport infrastructure, so this is a broad question, so allowed for both car users and people travelling on public infrastructure. So what we found here is that generally quite good to very good across most of the region. We do get a few spots where we see poor or moderate kind of level of transport infrastructure in Kerry and Galway, but particularly Cork seems to be an area where tourists are highlighting where there is a lower level of transport infrastructure. And when we look at the road network, so and how much of the Wild Atlantic Way is classed as primary route or secondary roads or the local or tertiary roads, we can see that for the Haven Coast, which is kind of covers the region in this southern part of the Wild Atlantic Way, mostly in Cork, from Kinsale out to Bantry, we can see that it has the lowest percentage of primary road between the different regions in the Wild Atlantic Way. So this is maybe correlating with the experiences that the tourists are having, in that they're spending more of their time on the secondary and local roads rather than primary roads in that region. In terms of linking back to traffic, we've started looking at the traffic measurements. So Transport Infrastructure Ireland have open traffic data on 400 points. So just to give an example of this data, what we're trying to do now is link this data back to the date and location, the nearest location where the surveys were undertaken. So we can see here that we do see, this is for Dingle, so for Dingle is available from 2019 to 2020. And what we're seeing there is that we can see that there is a peak in this traffic the 2 weeks after the August bank holiday. So you're going from a base of around 2,500 traffic movements up to nearly 6,000 for 2018, 2019. And then, of course, we can see with COVID, as Daithí was saying, there was a big drop off after St. Patrick's Day with the lockdown. So we can see that in the data. And then this year we do have a peak again, but we can see that that peak is about nearly 45% down on the usual peak for the August bank holiday weekend. So I think this is a good source of data that we can use to monitor what's going on in the Wild Atlantic Way. Of course, we can't talk about dingle without talking about fungi. So we look back at the data. So this was in 2019, so when fungi was still around. So of our sample, 12%, so 1 in 8 of our respondents named fungi as one of their top 3 highlights. And of that, we see 74% of those were Irish. So most of the people that were given fungi as a highlight were Irish. And when we look at those, when we look at the data, we can see in terms of the days on holiday or the number of adults, there's not much difference. But what we do see is there's a big difference there in terms of the children. So we're more likely to get fungi as a highlight when children are in the group, in the party. And just to finish off, so again, we looked at the highlights, and we basically classified them and made a word cloud of it. And the thing that once we strip out location data, what we see is landscape. So landscape is the biggest thing that people are highlighting as a highlight within their holiday along the Wild Atlantic Way. We can also see some other things like beach, cliffs, atmosphere, people. But the big one is landscape. So how we take care of the landscape and ensuring the sustainability of the landscape, I think is really important along the Wild Atlantic Way. So thanks for that, Stephen, and I'll stop this sharing the screen now.
Thank you for that, Danny, and I liked your slide there on fungi. Hopefully he's just sick of lockdown and will be back. We'll see. Just before I hand over to Desiree, there's been a few questions there about whether the recording will be available. Yes, the Whitaker Institute will send out all participants a copy of the recording when they have it ready. So yeah, everyone will get a copy. So Desiree, I'm going to hand on to you. Thanks.
Perfect. All right, thank you, Stephen. So I'll be presenting then the Irish case study for Work Package 7 of the Moses Project. And this should be a real-time example of some of the objectives that Daithí mentioned previously. So the Moses Project seeks to assess blue growth pathways for coastal tourism by a living lab approach. And this approach is achieved by facilitating community-led research. And Rathmullen, you'll see on the map here, is located up in the Northern Headlands region, and it has the gold star there for you. And to date, there have been significant grassroots efforts in Rathmullen to overcome some of the barriers to tourism that they experience specifically in their village. And this is mainly done then by organizing themselves as a community working group called Rathmullen The Way Forward. And they've identified and overcome some barriers I'll discuss later on in the presentation, but there's still some work to be done, especially if they want to maintain a sustainable tourism product for their village. And since the Wild Atlantic Way is ultimately strengthened by communities, it's important that they feel a sense of ownership and empowerment within the initiative. The perceptions and attitudes at the local level represent local knowledge or unique local voices that are essential for being captured and utilized during all phases of planning and development. And the framework here on this slide was developed after working with the Rathmullen community and learning this process firsthand. You'll see the base of the triangle there is bolstered by a collaborative effort between research and facilitated engagement from the outside of the community. So whether that be us in academia and, you know, through the Moses Project, or whether that be supported by local authorities, Fáilte Ireland, Tourism Board, etc. And then it all starts though by the community itself. So the community sees a need at that community level, and that represents a bottom-up initiative. Then facilitated collaboration and research, representing a top-down effort. But together, the white triangle in the center there, together you can generate a pathway, and hopefully it's a sustainable pathway that leads to informed decisions for long-term development. The example here that I've given briefly is the location of the battery in Rathmullen. It's a historic site. It's been used for various purposes over the years, but it's currently going under different phases or different options for plans for refurbishment, and how the community is undergoing public consultation to determine just how they want to be able to use it going into the future. So an illustrative example of how we harness these community voices, and again, specifically to Rathmullen, is this participatory mapping workshop, which I hosted in October 2019. And you'll notice as I click through them, you'll see each individual marked their map in a unique way, representing their own personal perceptions and attitudes of their environment. And they did this as a response to 3 prompts from myself. So the first one, they were asked, where in your community does the Wild Atlantic Way demonstrate significant value? And this was explained to be intangible values, so cultural, recreational, personal, ethical. The second prompt then, and the values are represented in orange on all the maps. The second prompt then was, where do you consider to be the most significant areas for tourism within your community? And again, those are represented in the pink color. And the third prompt then, they were asked where in the community represents significant areas for the economy. And that's going to be represented in green. And as I click through, you can see that each individual marked, separately, different methods of mapping, but they also provided their own context and explanation of their choices. And this is that unique local voice that I was talking about previously, where you really can get a deeper understanding of what it is to live and work and exist in a community. But what we can do then from the individual maps is build a composite map based on the consensus of each of the individuals. So this map here on this screen with the same color scheme demonstrates some of the key findings from that workshop. And they are threefold. Rathmullen serves as a gateway community to signature destination points on the Wild Atlantic Way, like Faned Head and Malin Head up here. So tourists have to go through Rathmullen to reach these destinations. And so Rathmullen has to, in some way, figure out how they can harness that tourist power and use it as a revenue stream for the community. There's also significant emphasis was given on the ferry route between Rathmullen and Buncrana here. So despite only running seasonally, the ferry provides an essential service to events that go on throughout the year, but also significant mode of transportation for tourists and locals to get across Lough Swilly. So the ferry is one of the main connection points between the Faned Peninsula and the Inishowen Peninsula. The third then key finding is the polygon created by the economic zone there. So a large portion of that is held to be important within Lough Swilly itself. So not only does Rathmullen rely on fishing and the ferry and other services within the loch. But historically, it's very important because Rathmullen used to be a naval base. So its use has transitioned over time, but again, you'll see that the value has been maintained. A trend that we noticed in the workshop is that local values often coincide with what tourists are seeking on their trips. So you'll see the locals were very interested in pointing out Glenveigh National Park, Ards Forest Park and Friary, the beaches along the Atlantic Drive, Inch Island. These are all locations that these locals would have grown up visiting or have family. They have memories of vacations themselves. But then you'll notice that these are also locations that are pointed out as designations along the Wild Atlantic Way by Fáilte Ireland. And this is all grand and good, but how is this important for developing sustainable coastal trails in the future, because the Wild Atlantic Way already exists? But if we put it back into the framework I showed at the beginning, and we plug in the real-time efforts of Rathmullen, you can see how this framework can be adapted and duplicated in other communities along the Wild Atlantic Way, but also in other areas where they may be interested in developing a sustainable coastal trail on their own. So the specific examples here in the images are to Rathmullen, but the suggestions that we would provide are more general for any village or community to adapt. And these would be to provide improved infrastructure. Generally, this would mean roadworks, accommodation, shared facilities like the one pictured here, the Rathmullen Pier and Tourism building, but also telecommunications throughout areas where tourists would be interested in posting videos and photos from their trip, hashtagging what they're doing, and providing word of mouth tourism in that way, in that social media aspect. The second suggestion then is to identify and respond to environmental damages in line with national level guidelines. So despite Rathmullen being or suffering from a very seasonal tourism season, and that being one of their main barriers, the environmental aspect of, the environmental sustainability aspect of the whole project is essential, because you want to have, your best face forward when the tourist season hits. And this would be, again, similar to Daithí's example in Clare at the Cliffs of Moher. You want to have, less environmental damage at a site where people are paying to tour and get their photo, and you're promoting a picturesque and wild and rugged landscape you want to be able to deliver. The third suggestion then is to identify and develop unique experiences that draw and entice your visitors to stay longer. So again, this is in line with the objectives Daithí mentioned that Fáilte Ireland is putting forward, the geographical development plans, where not only are you separated is the Wild Atlantic Way separated into regions, but geographic areas would have experiences based on nearby attractions that would enhance the experience, make it more hands-on, and empower the communities to really take on that tourism experience themselves, so that tourists are enticed to return year after year. And these pathways then are you can duplicate them and recreate them to fit other locations, but these pathways would lead to sustainable blue growth in a coastal tourism trail. Thank you. And we'll have questions then after this, I believe, right, Stephen?
Thank you, Desiree. Yeah, exactly. So thanks to all our speakers there. We have a number of questions actually already in. And yeah, please, if there's more, put them into our Q&A on the Q&A tab there. Daithí, if I might start with you. We just had one question there asking about what measures are in place to make sure that areas do not suffer from unsustainable tourism? So if you have reached a point where you maybe have a situation of overcrowding, overcapacity, what can be done in those situations?
Yeah, a great question. I suppose there's two sides to it. What are we doing to monitor destinations so that they don't suffer in the future? And then what are we doing with existing destinations? Because we know that the Wild Atlantic Way, particularly this year, experienced a lot. It was exceptionally popular. And what we have on the Wild Atlantic Way are a number of destinations which are overpopulated. And that's something that we're trying to combat. So to look at the two approaches, Ibrahim, we monitor visitor numbers across the country, and we monitor them at each destination along the Wild Atlantic Way. Where destination visitor numbers are increasing, we work hand in hand with the community groups on the ground to ensure that whatever development they do achieve, that it is encouraging the dispersal of a visitor and also enhances the product to ensure that visitors stay and that they spend. In terms then of, I'll give the Cliffs of Moher example, where we have an issue with the Cliffs of Moher. Number one, it's densely populated, and number two, visitor behaviour is just not the type of tourists that we want, where they jump on a coach in Dublin, land down at the Cliffs of Moher, go out, see the area, jump in and go back. So what we've been doing over the last number of years is developing a Cliffs of Moher master plan, which will enhance and broaden the product offer in the Cliffs of Moher, encourage the experience, ensure that the experience is actually extended, so that it encourages the visitors to travel north of that photographic spot at the castle, to ensure that they stay longer, and then to look at the community offering around the Cliffs of Moher. So we have the music house, we have the Burren Smokehouse, we have the Burren Chocolate Factory, all of those experiences to ensure that we're cross-selling, so that when the visitor does come down to the Cliffs of Moher, that they are encouraged to disperse. Now, all of those then are tied in what we call visitor experience development plans. We have a number of those in place at the moment. They're in place in the Burren, they're in place in Limerick is a gateway plan. They're in place in Galway. There's one being developed in Mayo and Donegal at the moment. And all of those then are environmentally assessed to look at some of the risks in areas where there's over tourism, or areas that are highly populated with tourist numbers, to look at the natura and the environmental impact of those.
Okay.
I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, no, that's great, Daithí, thank you. And maybe just one more there for you as well. A question on if you're an agency or even an individual who's responsible for coastal cultural amenities that maybe need a bit of development, but just in terms of getting up and running in developing those assets into a feature to be part of the Wild Atlantic Way. I know you could, I'm sure Fáilte Ireland have loads of supports in that, but just where to start, maybe if you could give just a flavour of where someone responsible for those kind of assets would start.
Yeah, it's a great question, because there's so many different areas out there between county council, between heritage offices, between Fáilte Ireland. The best protocol is to contact us, and I should have put up my contact details on the slide there, but it's daithí.gallagher@fáilteireland.ie. And if there is, the best thing is to get in touch with one of the team, one of the Fáilte Ireland team, because we'd have a good grasp of what supports are available. And what we would do in that scenario is look at what the asset is, what it can offer, and maybe bring someone in to either link in with an existing offer somewhere else in the Wild Atlantic Way where someone could learn from what's been done elsewhere, or we could bring in a mentor with particular expertise in that area. And a lot of our work as of late is maybe conducting feasibility studies in certain areas, because it's all good and well sitting on an asset and saying this could be and this has the potential, but we actually need to ensure that there's research done that takes into consideration definitely the potential, but also, as we've been talking about, is it sustainable? What are the resources around it to ensure that it can actually develop? Or is it just a one-off product that really isn't going to have a significant impact? So in terms of getting on the ladder, contact us, daithí.gallagher@fáilteireland.ie.
Okay, great, thanks, Daithí. And a question here for you, Danny. Just there was a question there about coach group tourism, and was that included in the survey if someone was a member of a coach group, and how much yeah, how much can they be held responsible for overcrowding roads and visitor attractions?
Well, in terms of, we looked at those who were travelling by bus or train. So for Irish, it was about 3% of the sample, of the Irish sample. And then for the overseas, about 19% of people were travelling by bus or train. So overall, the sample, about 11% of the sample is travelling that way. In terms of the level of transport infrastructure, kind of what they were asked, we tried to keep it was a 10-minute survey, so we're trying to keep it broad and capture both perceptions, you know what I mean? Like, so they were kind of asked about the road infrastructure, the road capacity, parking, but also what they considered of the public transport, so it was included. And then in terms of, I suppose, organised trips, like whether your trip was done by yourself or whether it's done by your organised trip. So for Irish it was 5%, and for overseas it was 20% on these. So we were capturing some, I'm not saying it, we'd have to look into the data a bit more, but we were capturing some people who were on these coach trips coming down to these sites. Okay,
so I think you've answered the second question there as well on the transport infrastructure and what was asked. Yeah. Was it more than just no? So it
was a Likert style question, and it was kind of open to try and capture both. We were aware we would capture both. So as I said, they were asked about road quality, road capacity, parking, and public transport.
Okay, thanks, Danny. Desiree, one for you here. Just wondering, could you explain the notion of values again briefly? Understand economy and tourism, but values. What do you mean by values there?
Yeah, so the values aspect was trying to capture the idea of intangible values. So not something that would be necessarily a tourism site specifically or something that would contribute to the economy directly, but sites where the locals had emotional, recreational, cultural connections to. So they would attribute a value to these areas based on that category.
Okay, thanks. And just one other thing there, Desiree, was, did you see any particular issues raised maybe across a number of participants for Rathmullen from that people were worried about in terms of the increase in numbers going through the town?
I think their main concern is their short tourism season, and then their ability to maintain what they can offer based on their short tourism season. So there's a lag of what, like businesses then can only operate for a set number of months of the year, but people live there year round. And so sometimes those businesses or services then are cut off even from the local community because it's just not sustainable as a business outside of the tourist season. So seasonality is one main concern. Also accommodation is another one. So the infrastructure comes into play in that sense as well. So there's definitely room within Rathmullen to branch out and grow in terms of a destination beyond just a drive-through village. But again, it takes, efforts of planning, local authority, collaboration, and the community's willingness, which their organization is by far, it exceeds what's probably necessary. So that's good. They have that going for them.
Okay, that's interesting. Okay, thanks, Desiree. Daithí, another one here for you. So in the context of dispersing tourists more widely and dispersing income benefits locally, what consideration has been given to sustainable travel? So in order, in particular, to minimize impacts on climate change or from climate change?
Yeah, really, really tough question. Geez, they're giving me some tough ones here. It's a difficult question in terms of the Wild Atlantic Way and its transport infrastructure. We'd love if there was a train going from Mizen to Mallinhead, or that there wasn't such a reliance on single transport. But and then the combat of that is if we talk about maybe bus infrastructure and ensuring that we see less cars on the road. The problem with that is this year there were virtually no buses on the Wild Atlantic Way. There were absolutely, the reduction in congestion complaints was phenomenal. We're normally dealt with a litany of complaints from local authorities saying that there were huge congestion issues. While there were still congestion issues, the fact that the buses weren't there just had a huge impact. So it's really difficult to strike that balance. Now, interestingly, in the last couple of weeks, we've been conducting a lot of international benchmarking. And this is comparing ourselves to other destinations. We just made comparisons to Slovenia around Lake Bled, and also to a destination in America called Jackson Hole. It's really close to Yellowstone, and the way in which smaller towns and smaller, I suppose they call it cities, benefit from a huge tourist amenity on their doorstep. And what other areas have started to do is to apply for international accreditation. So Slovenia and Jackson Hole have appeared on the global top 100 sustainable destinations. And that's where we want to go. We want to start benchmarking. We want to start competing internationally for accreditation. But how does that happen first? So in Jackson Hole, we saw the development of a sustainable report card, which maps carbon output, which looks at which delves down into hotels and how they can, and their event management, and can they offer reduced waste events and can they also look at complete in Slovenia they've completely eliminated single-use plastics along there. They have a route there themselves around Lake Bled. They've completely eliminated single-use plastics. So we have to set those benchmarking KPIs, and where traditionally we would look at our KPIs as visitor numbers, visitor spend, the length of a visitor stay, dispersing throughout the area, and also looking at the seasonal changes. We're in 5 years' time, we won't be talking about that as much. That'll be there, but we'll be talking about carbon output. We'll be talking about the use of single-use plastics. We'll be talking about emissions, and that's where we have to change our thinking to ensure that the trade and the industry reacts accordingly.
Yeah, I suppose it's looking at those supply chains and trying to keep them local. Yeah.
Certainly.
And just maybe, Daithí, I don't know if you're in a position to answer this or not, but there was another question there about that you mentioned the Wild Atlantic Way Museum, for instance, in Galway, but so these big initiatives, big attractions, but someone's asking here about lower scale maybe items, things even like water fountains in towns or whatever it might be. Just what's the thinking on that, on trying to, small developments? But again, I suppose it comes back, there is a number of supports there, but I suppose it's contact local councils.
Yeah, the challenge we have in Galway is when we talk about the museum, Galway is just such a phenomenal destination. But when we actually start talking about indoor attractions in Galway, we're low on numbers, which is why the museum will be such an important development. Yeah, in terms of local amenities, then that's hand in hand with ourselves. So through our VEDPs, we provide funding schemes on a smaller scale for local areas and for also local products to ensure that that again it's developing. So a prime example of that is the cultural centre, the Pierce's Cottage in Listermullen. That was supported by Fáilte Ireland. It's a small visitor centre, really unique, but a great story about Pierce and Pierce's life and his time in Connemara and learning the language. Sorry, VEDPs. I'm the visitor experience destination plan. Really, it's just a plan for the destination to ensure that it's developing sustainably. I'm a culprit of using my own acronyms too much. Apologies for that, folks. But VEDPs, they're kind of being used internationally now. We set the standard in many ways for that, and you see them being implemented internationally, looking at the destination and how it develops.
Okay, thanks, Daithí. And I think you highlighted, I suppose, the domestic tourism sector this year. I'm sure we've all noticed it. I live in a coastal area, and I've been blown away where the quiet spots I used to go to, how many local people are using them now. So I suppose that all bodes well for when things get back to normal, that the domestic market, we will see a much, I think it's going to take a while before people are willing maybe to travel again or outside the country in the same numbers. So I think we probably will see that those increased numbers of domestic tourists on the Wild Atlantic Way. So it's only going to mean more business, but I suppose also more pressure. So look at, we're our time is up here. I just want to thank the speakers again for some really fantastic talks. Thank the audience for their comments and their questions. And also just finally to thank the Whitaker Institute for allowing us to host the Moses webinar through the Whitaker Institute. Particular thanks to Angela and Courtney there. So just to say, if people, we will have other webinars looking at other industries in the ocean economy. So I think it's our Portuguese partner are next, and they're going to be focusing on aquaculture. So keep an eye out on the Moses website, www.mosesproject.eu, and look at the news page there, and there'll be more details coming up on that. So with that, we'll say thank you to everyone, and hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.